Não sabes o quê? Vamos então dar início à nossa palestra Sedas Nunes de 2025. Excelentíssimo Senhor Vice-Reitor da Universidade de Lisboa, Dr. João Peixoto, Excelentíssima Senhora Professora Olivette Otele, nossa keynote speaker de hoje, caros colegas docentes e investigadores de outras escolas que nos acompanham hoje aqui, investigadores do ICS, membros do corpo técnico e caríssimos estudantes. Professor Otele, many thanks for being with us here today. As Director of ICS, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Sedas Nunes lecture, which represents an important moment of our institution's calendar. History has been one of the pillars of this institute's research from its foundation in the mid-1960s. Indeed, to fulfill the ICS founder and namesake of this lecture, Adélico Sedas Nunes' vision of an interdisciplinary research institute, he rightly found that other social sciences would benefit immensely from the depth of historical approaches. And perhaps that history too would gain from being immersed in a social sciences environment with its permanent focus on current challenges of our time. I therefore thank you for contributing to fulfill our mission to provide enriching inter- and transdisciplinary dialogues within the social sciences. And now I shall switch to Portuguese for the rest of my speech. É com grande satisfação que dou as boas-vindas a todos a esta palestra Sedas Nunes de abertura do ano académico, um momento significativo para a nossa comunidade neste início de ano letivo. Nestas palavras que preparei, gostaria, por um lado, de partilhar a minha visão sobre o ciclo de mudança institucional que está agora a chegar ao fim no ICS e que, estou convicta, irá servir de base para o fortalecimento da pós-graduação tal como ela existe, e, por outro, de dar as boas-vindas aos nossos estudantes do ICS, especialmente àqueles que agora iniciam os seus percursos de doutoramento, que é a razão de ser desta palestra. Permitam-me apresentar brevemente o ciclo de renovação que, enquanto comunidade e sempre trabalhando colaborativamente, terminámos em 2025 e que, com todas as incertezas em que vivemos, e são muitas, tanto a nível institucional como político, penso não ser demasiado ousado afirmar que nos coloca, a nós, ICS, num caminho de sustentabilidade que nos escapava há anos ou mesmo décadas. Esse ciclo de renovação incluiu 3 mudanças principais: uma transição geracional de investigadores, uma reorganização e reforço do quadro técnico do ICS e a obtenção do reconhecimento de excelência na última avaliação das unidades de ID, que nos oferece um horizonte de relativa sustentabilidade financeira para o próximo quinquênio. Quando olhamos para o ICS tal como ele é hoje, vemos que invertemos, em condições muito difíceis, 2 desequilíbrios estruturais que existiam e que prejudicavam o nosso funcionamento. Por um lado, a proporção entre investigadores do quadro e precários. Atualmente temos pela primeira vez em muitos anos uma maioria de investigadores de quadro no conjunto total de investigadores, devido à contratação de 21 novos colegas de quadro distribuídos pelas várias áreas científicas, sendo esta a maior vaga de recrutamentos na história recente do ICS. Por outro lado, conseguimos reestruturar a pirâmide de categorias, de facto invertendo-a, através de um conjunto de promoções que se foram realizando nos últimos 2 anos. E atualmente temos bastantes mais investigadores auxiliares de quadro do que principais e mais principais do que coordenadores. Esta mudança foi concomitante com a saída por reforma de um conjunto de investigadores séniores que felizmente continuam a acompanhar-nos. Temos estimulado e promovido a atribuição do título de emérito a vários destes colegas, com o apoio da reitoria, a quem agradeço. A par da transformação das carreiras dos investigadores, houve uma transição geracional fundamental também do lado dos serviços técnicos. Criaram-se novos cargos de direção que permitem melhorar a melhor coordenação e foram celebrados vários contratos de quadro para consolidar as carreiras e promover a estabilidade necessária que alicerça todo o trabalho que aqui realizamos. Ainda no que diz respeito à mudança na comunidade ICS, gostaria de deixar uma nota de pesar e uma palavra de reconhecimento para aquelas colegas que infelizmente partiram este ano. A Celeste Pires, técnica do ICS ao longo de mais de 30 anos, e a Ana Horta, nossa colega socióloga e investigadora auxiliar. A Ana sempre demonstrou um enorme empenho nas atividades da pós-graduação, era responsável também por a apresentação de um mestrado no ICS e nos deixou prematuramente há cerca de um mês. Em nome de todos, presto-lhes homenagem, agradecendo todo o empenho e dedicação que sempre tiveram com esta casa. Este ano, houve também uma renovação do nosso estatuto de excelente como comunidade de ID, num processo colaborativo com os vários órgãos do ICS, incluindo o Grupo de Trabalho e o Conselho Científico. Esse estatuto, juntamente com o Estatuto de Laboratório Associado, que já tivemos notícia, será prorrogado em 2026, coloca o ICS num quadro de estabilidade que é, a todos os títulos, relativamente novo na nossa história recente. Naturalmente, a estabilidade não pode ser um fim, mas antes um meio. É um meio para concretizar a nossa missão, tanto a nível da investigação como da pós-graduação e extensão. Saibamos aproveitá-la. Por vezes as condições mudam, mas as mentalidades não. Ao longo dos últimos anos, o tema da precariedade dominou os trabalhos do ICS. Diria, no entanto, que o principal desafio hoje é a plena integração dos novos investigadores e o desenvolvimento do trabalho do ICS num quadro institucional e político em acelerada mudança. Este novo ICS permite perspectivar um maior contributo dos investigadores de carreira nos vários cursos de pós-graduação que temos, assim contribuindo para a sua consolidação. Isso irá também alinhar o ICS com o novo ESIC, o Estatuto da Carreira de Investigação, onde, pela primeira vez, se estipula que cada investigador pode, ou será que deve, lecionar 4 horas de aulas. Mas há ainda outras mudanças a assinalar neste último ano para reforço da pós-graduação que eu queria destacar. Em primeiro lugar, a aprovação do mestrado Interdisciplinary Social Research, que será coordenado pela Alice Ramos e que terá início já em setembro de 26, em colaboração com a Faculdade de Ciências e o ISCS. E está também em preparação a submissão de mais um mestrado em inglês, que será a submeter à aprovação do Senado em breve. E, em conjunto, estes 2 mestrados irão não apenas contribuir para a integração dos investigadores, como potenciar a oferta pós-graduada do ICS, que com esta equipa reitoral continua a apostar na internacionalização dos estudos pós-graduados em colaboração interescolas para afirmar a identidade da nova Universidade de Lisboa. Chegados aqui, poderão estar a pensar: eis um retrato pan-glauciano do ICS, onde tudo está bem no melhor dos mundos, como dizia o mentor de Candide no livro de Voltaire. Se estou a defender a nossa estabilidade e consolidação recente, é porque eu estou plenamente consciente da nossa fragilidade, como sendo uma constante da identidade do ICS. Ou não fôssemos nós uma instituição de investigação em ciências sociais, inserida num sistema científico nacional constantemente subfinanciado, onde o parque de investimento na ciência fundamental e nas ciências sociais estão sempre ameaçados. Acompanhamos com grande preocupação os desenvolvimentos mais recentes, nomeadamente a perspectiva da extinção da FCT, precisamente numa altura em que a nossa estabilidade, a estabilidade que alcançamos, envolve uma dependência ainda maior em relação a esta instituição. Como sabem, a fusão da FCT vem num pacote que prevê a sua fusão com a ANI e submissão a uma tutela dupla ou tripla, é tripla efetivamente, ciência, finanças e economia. Esta extinção e reformulação da FCT é uma mudança estrutural que não estava prevista no programa de governo, não foi legitimada nas urnas, não é recomendada por nenhuma instância internacional e não existe em funcionamento em nenhum outro país. O modelo é supostamente o Reino Unido, mas neste país não há tutelas múltiplas. A fundação equivalente lá está apenas dependente da ciência e a inovação e a investigação científica mantêm-se autónomas sob um chapéu abrangente. A somar a estas mudanças institucionais no horizonte, as mudanças políticas sistémicas em curso também são fonte de apreensão. Por razões pessoais, tenho tido a oportunidade de passar várias semanas nos Estados Unidos no último ano e meio, contactando com vários colegas de universidades lá, como que numa visita ao futuro, que em breve poderá chegar à Europa e também a Portugal. Posso dizer-vos que estou lá a ver o que eu vejo é um caminho político de autocratização na América de Trump, de forma inequívoca, com consequências graves para a liberdade e a autonomia universitária, especialmente nas ciências sociais, bem como para o financiamento da ciência em geral. À nossa escala, estou mesmo convencida que este trabalho de fortalecimento do ICS é imprescindível num combate que já está em curso pela qualidade e mesmo pela existência da nossa democracia. É neste quadro que, dirigindo-me aos alunos, cientistas sociais do futuro, gostaria de vos dar as boas-vindas e os parabéns pela escolha que fizeram de começar um doutoramento connosco nestes tempos exigentes de mudança institucional e política. Estou convicta que tomaram uma decisão importante e necessária, que também individualmente vai contribuir para a qualidade da nossa democracia hoje e no futuro. Queria dizer-vos que o ICS é uma instituição de proximidade. Temos a grande preocupação de integrar os doutorandos como membros plenos e ativos dos grupos de investigação, no âmbito dos quais colaboram e desenvolvem os seus projetos individuais, num ambiente de ensino aberto e colegial que estimula a liberdade, a autonomia e a criatividade no desenvolvimento de projetos de investigação doutoral. Também apelamos a que participem na governança da instituição, para a qual estão convocados e espero que possam responder afirmativamente. Faço votos sinceros para que possam encontrar aqui um ambiente propício ao vosso desenvolvimento intelectual, académico e pessoal e onde se sintam, tal como nós nos sentimos, em casa. A terminar, e sabendo que este é o meu último discurso de mandato enquanto diretora na Palestra Sedas Nunes, gostaria de fazer alguns agradecimentos. Em primeiro lugar, à diretora executiva Andreia Rojão Silva, à diretora de serviços Eugénia Rodrigues e à chefe de divisão dos recursos humanos Mafalda Vieira. Nunca esquecerei tudo aquilo que aprendi convosco, todo o apoio que recebi e toda a dedicação que demonstraram ao longo dos últimos anos. Elas são, caros amigos, caros colegas, verdadeiros pilares do ICS. Agradeço também profundamente ao Conselho de Gestão, a Susana Matos Viegas, o Vítor, a Sérgio Ferreira e a Adalina Rodrigues Sanches, que têm constituído uma equipa formidável na resolução de problemas e abraçando os vários desafios que se foram colocando, desde o desenvolvimento informático do ICS, o acompanhamento das obras em curso, as melhores formas de encontrar garrafas de moscatel quando nós temos para fazer brindes àquilo que se consegue fazer com muitas dificuldades e poucos recursos no ICS, bem como melhores formas de apoiar todos os investigadores da casa. A lealdade institucional constante do Presidente da Escola, Pedro Magalhães, e da Presidente do Conselho Científico, Ângela Barreto Xavier, foram um amparo crucial ao bom entendimento dos vários órgãos e ao aprofundamento do processo que é constante e permanente de deliberação que caracteriza a vida deste Instituto. Quero também agradecer a quem se envolveu na preparação desta palestra, bem como aqueles que integram a pós-graduação, investigadores e técnicos, com uma palavra especial para a Alice Ramos, coordenadora desta pós-graduação. Finalmente, a cada um dos técnicos e investigadores que contribuem para tornar o ICS um farol de investigação, pós-graduação e extensão em Portugal e no mundo hoje, um enorme obrigada. E termino agradecendo a todos e a cada um de vós pela vossa presença e passando a palavra então agora ao nosso aluno do programa de Doutoramento em História, Patrick Vieira. Obrigada. Peço desculpa, houve aqui um engano. Vou então passar a palavra à nossa Presidente da Comissão de Estudos Pós-Graduados, Alice Ramos. Obrigada.
Senhora Diretora do ICS, Doutora Marina Costa Lobo, Senhora Presidente do Conselho Científico, Doutora Xavier, Senhor Vice-Reitor da Universidade de Lisboa, Professor Doutor Peixoto, Dizia Professora Olivette Otele, caros membros da comunidade do ICS, caros estudantes. Sejam muito bem-vindos ao ICS, outra vez. Andamos há 2 meses a dar as mãos. E obrigada por estarem nesta sessão que marca também o início de uma etapa na vida dos estudantes, estejam no início, a meio caminho ou prestes a terminar um percurso nem sempre fácil, mas sempre desafiante e de construção de competências de investigação em ciências sociais. Há mais ou menos um ano estávamos precisamente nesta sala também a dar as boas-vindas aos novos alunos e a celebrar o início do verão letivo. Nessa altura, sempre a minha intervenção nas iniciativas que o Conselho Pedagógico e a Comissão de Estudos Pós-Graduados, em colaboração com o Serviço de Gestão Académica, estavam a programar e implementar a curto e médio prazo. Desta vez gostava de vos falar também de outra coisa, do que a minha ainda curta passagem pela gestão académica e pela pós-graduação, aliada aos quase 30 anos dedicados nesta casa à investigação, influenciaram a forma como olho hoje para o ICS e para a nossa missão. Sim, porque o ICS tem uma missão. E somos nós quem leva a cabo essa missão. Independentemente do cargo, do estatuto ou da profissão que aqui exercemos. Relembrando a missão do ICS, desdobra-se em 3 linhas que se cruzam. Investigação inovadora sobre as sociedades contemporâneas, seus legados e desafios. Oferta de estudos pós-graduados em articulação direta com a investigação e transferência de conhecimento para a sociedade. Esta missão, a meu ver, pode ser cumprida de 2 maneiras. Na ótica da observação passiva e neutral ou na ótica da participação cívica e responsável. Ora, mais do que nunca, estou convencida de que o nosso trabalho tem de contribuir para uma reflexão séria e consequente sobre a sociedade portuguesa, com impacto na vida das pessoas e nas políticas públicas que afetam essas vidas. Sem pedir licença, faço minhas as palavras do nosso reitor. Não podemos ser meros observadores, temos que ser resposta e lugar de resistência. O ICS sempre fez questão de ser um espaço de liberdade e de democracia, guiado pela autonomia intelectual e o pensamento crítico e pela exigência de rigor científico e responsabilidade ética, propósitos que se tornam ainda mais prementes considerando os tempos conturbados e estranhos em que vivemos. Vi o 25 de Abril acontecer quando era criança. Durante a adolescência testemunhei debates políticos bem inflamados, mas nunca pensei que um dia veria 3 cartazes à beira das nossas estradas, como o que está no início da Alameda da Universidade, ou que ouviria alguém dizer que aquilo que o país precisa é 3 Salazares. Sabemos bem onde nos leva este ódio, este racismo, porque é disso também que se trata. Sabemos também que este ódio, este racismo, se espalha como um vírus, lançando medo e a desinformação, e que se alimenta das fragilidades, das preocupações reais das pessoas e das desigualdades sociais, para surgir como o salvador dos males que 50 anos de liberdade e democracia nos trouxeram. Qualquer que seja a área disciplinar, qualquer que sejam os tópicos de análise preferidos, faz parte da nossa missão contribuir para um debate público informado e aprofundado. Um debate que consiga viajar para lá da academia e que dê às pessoas armas para combater o medo gerado pela mentira e pela desinformação. É certo que o financiamento das ciências sociais vive dificuldades crescentes, mas não podemos deixar que isso esmoreça o nosso ano e complique a nossa missão. Temos de continuar a fazer investigação inovadora, promovendo a cooperação entre áreas de saber. Temos de continuar a contribuir para a formação de cientistas sociais com espírito crítico, teórico e metodologicamente exigentes, e temos de continuar a ser uma fonte de conhecimento para a sociedade. O ICS continua a ser avaliado como excelente, algo que nos orgulhamos e que nos traz algumas vantagens. Relativamente à parte que me toca, contribuir para a oferta de um ensino pós-graduado de qualidade, considero que para alcançarmos e mantermos um nível de excelência, temos de fomentar uma cultura científica de colaboração e de exigência. Enquanto docentes e orientadores, temos de ser exigentes com o nosso trabalho. Temos de ser capazes de ouvir e de aprender. E, claro, temos de ser exigentes com o trabalho dos estudantes. Aos estudantes pedimos empenho e dedicação, mas também que sejam exigentes com os vossos orientadores e docentes, que os questionem, que os desafiem. Pode parecer um bocado lamechas o que vou dizer, mas sem vocês, estudantes, o ICS não faz muito sentido. Precisamos da diversidade que trazem, da capacidade de agitar águas. Precisamos também, como disse a Diretora, que participem na vida do ICS, que se façam representar nos órgãos de gestão, nomeadamente no Conselho Pedagógico, pois é aí que são tomadas muitas das decisões que vos dizem respeito. Participem também em algumas das iniciativas que o ICS organiza, nomeadamente o Open Day, o Programa de Mentoria e o Seminário de Estudos Avançados. O Open Day é um evento organizado pelos estudantes do Conselho Pedagógico, em que os doutorandos e doutorandas apresentam muito brevemente o seu trabalho a toda a comunidade ICS, constituindo uma oportunidade única para que todos possamos conhecer o trabalho que estão a desenvolver em temas e áreas científicas muito diversos. Para os estudantes é o momento de saberem que os colegas dos outros cursos estão a investigar e partilhar experiências e saberes. O Open Day já faz parte do calendário académico, afirmando-se assim a sua importância e dinamização junto à comunidade ICS. Realizar-se-á nos dias 27 e 28 de maio. Estejam por isso atentos às notícias, pois contamos desde já com a vossa participação. O programa de mentoria foi pensado para proporcionar a cada um dos estudantes que agora iniciam o seu percurso no ICS um apoio mais personalizado, oferecido por doutorandos de anos mais avançados, que podem ajudar em questões tão diversas como a organização e participação nos grupos de investigação, a realização de trabalhos académicos, o funcionamento dos serviços de apoio do ICS, a procura de alojamento, entre outros. Este ano demos início ao programa de mentoria, que foi muito bem recebido e que iremos monitorizar. Em janeiro, abriremos de novo uma manifestação de interesse para potenciais mentores e por isso peço aos presentes que ajudem a divulgar esta iniciativa e que se disponibilizem também como mentores, de modo a apoiarem os futuros colegas no seu processo de integração. O Seminário de Estudos Avançados é um programa de conferências e masterclasses, organizado pelos coordenadores das 4 linhas temáticas do ICS. Parte da premissa de que a formação pós-graduada deve contemplar diferentes perspectivas teóricas e metodológicas e deve sair do mero contexto disciplinar, alargando o debate à diversidade de questões que marcam os desafios das sociedades contemporâneas. O programa de conferências, abertas a todos, e de masterclasses, dirigidas especialmente aos estudantes de pós-graduação, está disponível à entrada da sala e está disponível online. A próxima sessão realiza-se já no dia 9 de dezembro, onde poderemos ouvir Vincenzo Cicelli falar sobre as tensões que marcam as sociedades atuais, simultaneamente cada vez mais abertas e interdependentes, mas também mais conflituais, divididas e fragmentadas. Tudo o que acabei de dizer só pode ser feito quando há uma convergência de interesses e uma cooperação institucional forte. Assim, é da mais elementar justiça agradecer publicamente a todas as pessoas que me têm apoiado e que têm trabalhado comigo, nomeadamente Marina Costa Lobo, Eugénia Rodrigues, que hoje não vou estar aqui, o Daniel Cascão e a Adriana Inácio, do Serviço de Gestão Académica, assim como os meus colegas da Comissão de Estudos Pós-Graduados e do Conselho Pedagógico, com uma menção especial aos estudantes que continuam dedicadamente em funções: o António Barros, a Cátia Família e a Rita Reis. Espero, sinceramente, daqui a um ano estar a agradecer a outros estudantes. Vivam o ICS! Vejam este instituto como um espaço de investigação, de formação, mas também como um espaço de diálogo com todos que aqui coabitam, investigadores, estudantes e equipas técnicas. Aproveitem um ambiente de estudo em várias áreas do conhecimento, no domínio das ciências sociais e das humanidades. Aproveitem todos os recursos que o ICS disponibiliza, da biblioteca, o arquivo de História Social, das salas de estudo e, muito em breve, esperemos, a esplanada do jardim. Aproveitem a possibilidade de internacionalizarem o vosso trabalho ao nível da participação em projetos internacionais, da publicação em revistas e editoras de reconhecido mérito, da integração em redes de investigação com estudantes e investigadores internacionais. Termino, como sempre, desejando que sejam felizes no ICS e que recordem o doutoramento como um tempo, porque valeu a pena passar. Obrigada pela vossa atenção.
Boa tarde a todos. É uma honra estar aqui. Queria agradecer algumas palavras de agradecimento ao excelentíssimo vice-reitor, a Marina Costa Lobo, a Alice Ramos e a Eugénia Rodrigues, que me convidaram para a gente falar aqui hoje. Eu, quando eu recebi a chamada da Eugénia, que me ligou a pedir para que eu viesse falar aqui, eu sinceramente tinha achado estranho, não sabia o que dizer, pedi para ela que me explicasse o porquê desse convite. E uma coisa que eu deixei claro, e eu queria também repetir aqui, é que eu sou estudante do ICS, como muitos dos que estão aqui, não represento ninguém, mas o que foi convidado, eu fui convidado para dar um testemunho, e isso é que eu gostaria de fazer brevemente aqui, sobre o porquê que vale a pena estudar no ICS. Tá? Então, muito rapidamente vou me apresentar, para depois abordar esses pontos. Eu preparei 3 pontos. Eu conheço o ICS já faz tempo. Eu conheci o ICS quando eu cheguei Eu cheguei em Lisboa em 2006, 2007, para viver aqui. Bom, não sabia que havia muito tempo aqui, finalmente aqui para ficar. E foi à procura de um lugar bom para estudar. Eu ainda não era aluno do ICS, mas foi à procura de um lugar bom para estudar que eu descobri a biblioteca do ICS. E eu fiquei fascinado. Fiquei fascinado pelo acervo, fiquei fascinado pelo conforto do lugar, como um bom lugar para estar sentado a trabalhar. E, na altura, eu estava na dúvida do que fazer, em termos de estudo, de carreira, etc. Foi quando eu deparei com um folheto do mestrado em Antropologia Social e Cultural do ICS. Gostei da proposta, me candidatei, fui aceito. Na altura, o coordenador era o João Vasconcelos. E comecei um mestrado que, para mim, foi muito, muito, muito importante. Orientado pela professora Cristina Bastos, que até hoje me acompanha, agora no doutoramento. Passados muitos anos, eu não estou mais oficialmente em antropologia, estou em história, mas o bom aqui no ICS, essas disciplinas se tocam e as fronteiras são mais tênues do que em muitas outras instituições universitárias. Bom, acho que ficou mais ou menos claro como é que eu conheci o ICS. E eu queria justamente dizer que eu já acabei por abordar um primeiro ponto do porquê que vale a pena estudar aqui. Para mim, pessoalmente, a biblioteca é um bom lugar para trabalhar o acervo de excelência. O estudante também pode contribuir com esse acervo a pedir aquisições para a biblioteca, caso haja algum livro que não esteja lá. Também é possível pedir empréstimos entre bibliotecas. Não é preciso necessariamente viajar para outra universidade para ir, não é? Para além do acervo, claro, já mencionei o conforto. Para os que gostam de ficar mais isolados, preferem uma pequena bolha, por que não? Logo ao lado tem a sala dos doutorandos, atualmente é logo ao lado da biblioteca. E eu gostaria de não deixar de mencionar uma pequena pérola que tem não só historiadores, que é o Arquivo de História Social. Na altura que eu conheci o ICS, eu também acabei por conhecer o Arquivo de História Social, que era coordenado pela Rita Almeida de Carvalho, que hoje em dia é a minha orientadora do tese, e hoje é coordenado pela Inês Ponte, também muito bem gerido pelo João também. O arquivo é um pequeno tesouro para mesmo para quem não precisa necessariamente trabalhar ali, vale a pena dar uma olhada. Um conselho que eu deixo para os estudantes, para que visitem esse arquivo. Já falei da biblioteca, já falei do arquivo que está fisicamente nas instalações da biblioteca. E falando em localização, outra vantagem de estar no ICS é a sua localização. Não é? É um eixo aqui na cidade universitária, em que, para quem não encontra o necessário nesta biblioteca ou no arquivo de História Social, tem outros arquivos, tem outro bibliotomo, tem outras bibliotecas também por perto, e tem, claro, a Biblioteca Nacional. Portanto, para quem precisa percorrer, abre-se a porta do ICS, está ainda num ambiente de excelência. As condições materialmente estão bastante dadas para quem quiser fazer um bom trabalho. O segundo aspecto que eu queria mencionar, mais importante até do que o primeiro, são as pessoas. Já falei de algumas pessoas aqui, mas creio que antes de tudo é preciso mencionar os técnicos em geral, os recursos humanos, sem os quais esse instituto, assim como qualquer outro, simplesmente não poderiam funcionar. E aqui funciona muito, muito bem. Funciona muito bem, quer seja já os bibliotecários, o pessoal do arquivo, o pessoal, quer seja da recepção, da cantina, dos serviços acadêmicos. O bom trabalho deles garante a possibilidade de que nós façamos também o nosso trabalho e a nossa formação, evidentemente. Os professores, não pude deixar de fora, portanto, na minha formação em antropologia, todos os professores ficaram e ficam na minha memória até hoje. Foram muito importantes, não vou citar agora todos os nomes, já citei alguns. Reconheço aqui de vista a Suzana Matos Viegas, que está presente. Os outros, dei uma olhada pela sala para ver se eu reconhecia outros, já falei de alguns, mas os outros não parecem que estão aqui hoje. E atualmente sou aluno nós chamamos de PIUD, o Programa Interuniversitário de Doutoramento em História. Eu conheço aqui a Ângela Xavier, que está atualmente a ler junto com outros professores o meu trabalho, a Isabel Correia da Silva. E esse programa é interessante porque, além de ter uma proposta interdisciplinar, conjuga, em particular, com outras universidades numa espécie de consórcio para um bom programa de doutoramento em História que acompanha o estudante. O estudante de doutoramento, aqui mais uma vez, testemunho da minha parte, doutorando em História. O aluno não está abandonado com uma data para entrega de tese e nada mais. Ele está bastante bem acompanhado. As pessoas que vão ler, não só os orientadores, também professores que acompanham em seminários, para dar críticas, comentários e ajudas, não é? E os visitantes, são a terceira categoria de pessoas que eu encontrei aqui quando eu estava pensando para preparar essa apresentação. Como é o caso hoje, temos como Olivette. Fim da parte sobre as pessoas. A terceira que eu tinha preparado, mas não vale a pena eu me alongar, porque também já foi abordado pela diretora Marina Costa Lobo e pela Alice Ramos. Os grupos de investigação, os seminários são, portanto, lugares, eu diria, de encontro. Para quem quiser aproveitar o espaço do ICS como um espaço não só para a escrita da tese para quem está em doutoramento, como também para uma oportunidade de criação de uma rede de contatos, de conhecimento para ouvir, para ser ouvido também, aqui é um bom espaço. Tem, portanto, grupos de investigação, é possível conhecer, é possível ser convidado, é possível pedir para entrar, participar, onde há os mais variados temas, assim como os seminários. Tudo isso, portanto, se cruza para concluir, creio que 3 pilares que eu apresentei: o espaço, as pessoas e as ideias, que talvez formam o ICS, e espero que os estudantes que estejam aqui possam aproveitar ao máximo. Obrigado a todos.
Obrigada. Passamos então à segunda mesa, obviamente à palestra. Obrigada.
Bem, muito boa tarde a todas as pessoas presentes. Eu posso só pedir a todas as pessoas que estão em pé, ainda há muitos lugares ali, não se querem sentar agora neste pequeno intervalo. Ainda há muitos lugares aqui no meio, ou talvez as pessoas de lado virem mais para o centro, para não ficarem tanto tempo em pé. Bem, muito obrigada por estarem aqui hoje. Cumprimento especialmente as doutorandas e doutorandos que este ano iniciam o seu percurso no ICS e todos aqueles que estão a meio ou no fim das suas teses. Muita concentração e coragem. Começo assim por saudar o Patrick Figueiredo, que aqui está em vossa representação, e os outros membros da comunidade ICS que integram o programa de hoje. A Marina Costa Lobo, a nossa diretora, a quem agradeço especialmente o convite que me fez para organizar a Palestra Sedas Nunes deste ano, a Alice Ramos, Presidente do Conselho Pedagógico, e o João Mourato, que irá apresentar o Prémio de Extensão em Ciências Sociais. Saúdo também a Margarida Bernardo, que desde há anos organiza esta palestra, e como também tudo aquilo que acontece no ICS, com profissionalismo, dedicação e uma simpatia inexcedível. Um agradecimento especial ao Vice-Reitor da Universidade de Lisboa, o João Peixoto, que hoje nos honra com a sua presença e que irá fechar a sessão. Obrigada, João. And, last but not least, e com esta frase feita passo para o inglês, to Olivette Otele, a big thank you for being here today as an honourable speaker of this year's Palestra Sedas Nunes, named after ICS's founding father. I am so happy you said yes, and I will now briefly introduce you to our audience. Olivette Otele is an historian who currently holds the position of Distinguished Research Professor of the Legacies and Memory of Slavery in the Department of Law at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, at the University of London. She has published extensively, but her best known and most translated book is titled African Europeans, A Story Untold, published in Portugal under the title Europeus Africanos, Uma História por Contar. My brother, who's sitting there, thank you for coming, gave it to me as a Christmas present 2 years ago. And today we invited Editorial Presença to be here with a few copies at a discounted price. The book was first published in Great Britain in 2020, but soon after it was translated in many European countries and into many European languages: Portuguese, Spanish, Catalan, French, German, Italian, and I'm sure that there are more editions that I do not know about. The book received ravishing reviews from The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, and The Guardian, which also named it the best book of 2020, in addition to being shortlisted for the Orwell Prize for Political Writing and the LA Times Book Prize. It is an extraordinary achievement for a scholar of her generation, my generation, or for that matter, of any age and career stage, to have a history book so widely published, translated, read and acclaimed. More relevant still, because its author is a black woman, and its subject is that of the long history of African Europeans in Europe, and this in an Europe where black academics are still an unjustifiable minority, as it happens in Portugal, and where histories of women and of people of African descent have been absent from historiographical production and teaching until recently. We are witnessing very challenging political times, no doubt, but there are also many positive things happening today in many places. Despite much resistance, there is in today's Europe a greater openness and eagerness for discussing difficult subjects in and outside academia. Subjects that are at the center of Otele's work, such as slavery, colonialism, racism, or sexism. Subjects that a few years ago were much more invisible in academia or in the public sphere. This is also because academia now has more women and more ethnic minorities researching their own histories, their own genealogies than it had 50 years ago, or even 20. But also because feminist and anti-racist critical thought and social movements are indissociable from academic knowledge production and have influenced it. Olivette Otele's bibliography and biography is a testimony to this. She is herself an African European. Otele was born in Cameroon in Central Africa, Camarões in Portuguese in 1970. She was brought up in Paris, where she studied at the Sorbonne. First a degree in British and North American literature, then a master's degree in history, and finally a PhD on European colonial history and the politics of memory, especially centered in Bristol and its role in transatlantic slavery. She then continued her academic career in Great Britain, Bath, Bristol, and now London, where she became the first woman of African descent to be a full professor in history. In addition to the many positions held in educational institutions, she was Vice President of the Royal Historical Society, for example. Otele has served on juries for scientific and literary awards and frequently collaborates with newspapers and magazines in Europe and the United States, from the BBC to The Guardian, from The New Yorker to Vogue Italia. She has also been a consultant on public policies to banks and non-governmental organizations on issues related to colonial history and reparative justice. At the time when many historical institutions, finally, are reflecting on their own pasts and acknowledging their involvement or even their origins and prosperity in the trafficking of enslaved Africans. See, for example, The Guardian's excellent research project, Cotton Capital, published throughout the year of 2023, where Otele also collaborated. She also participated as a consultant on the Netflix series African Queens, where one of the protagonists is Queen Ninja, a queen of the region that is now Angola and a central figure in the relations between Angola and Portugal in the 17th century. Today, Otele continues to write about the history and legacies of colonial slavery. Her next book, to be published in 2026, will focus on the history of 15 European ports that were central to the slavery carried out by European empires for several centuries, and Lisbon, of course, is one of these ports. As we know, as Lisboetas, Lisbon is still coming to terms with its slavery past and with its recent colonial past, while finding its present place as one of the main African European cities. This diverse contemporary African diaspora is part of these reflections on how the Portuguese past affects its present and how and what should we memorialize and celebrate through monuments, artistic projects, plays, research and writing. I am sure Otele's words on Lisbon in her next book will contribute to this conversation. Today, Olivette Otele is our Palestra Sedas Nunes guest lecturer, and we are proud to have her here in Lisbon to speak on representations and trajectories of African Europeans, the subject of her most translated book, as I have referred, African Europeans. Here, I will only underline what I consider to be three of the book's accomplishments. In the first place, its ambitious topic and time and space frame with a chronology that goes from the 3rd to the 21st century and a wide geography that includes multiple Africas and multiple Europes, Portugal included. And Otele does so through the histories of specific characters, women and men. In the second place, the ways in which the book demonstrates how words matter, how words have meanings that are inseparable from past and present histories, and how we, as scholars, must be conscious of the words we use and why we use them. Spoken and written words are, after all, our working tools. And in the third place, the ways in which the book continuously moves from the past to present, to the many layers of history writing and of public history. In this trajectory, the book also contributes to the history of Black studies, to the thought and work of Black writers, scholars, feminists, and artists. Inspired by the autobiographical texts published by African Europeans that Olivette Otele refers in her book, I here finish with a quote by the African-American writer James Baldwin, a brilliant book I read this year. He was a brilliant mind who also spoke and wrote about himself and his life as a black and gay man born in Harlem, New York in the 1920s. And by doing so, he was also writing on history and politics, psychology and sociology. The feminist sentence from the 1970s, "the personal is political," could well apply to the case of James Baldwin and so many other black authors. And I will now read. History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us. We are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. If I may give one advice only for our new MA and PhD students, this would be it. Do not read academic articles and books only. Apart from going to classes and conferences, libraries, archives, and fieldwork, look around. Read literature and newspapers, go to exhibitions and museums, concerts, theatre, and film festivals. Many of these are cheap and free. Some of the most interesting work reflecting on past and present societies is being done today, not only by academics, but also by artists, writers, musicians, filmmakers, curators, and activists, on the lingering legacies of colonial and authoritarian pasts, on racial, gender, and social discrimination, on the fragile lives and rights of immigrants, and the unstable meanings of citizenship, or on the many dimensions of male violence towards women, like the one that this year has already killed 24 women in Portugal and has harmed many more, as we were reminded this week with the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Be open, be attentive, be critical, and remember that apart from being a researcher on the social sciences, you are also a citizen. Olivette Otele is the living proof that one can be both a brilliant and erudite scholar and an engaged voice for social justice. Thank you very much for all those present. Thank you very much, Olivette Otele, for your wonderful and inspirational work and example. And once again, for having accepted our invitation. Now, let's listen to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, I'm not used to being celebrated for such a long time, so it was kind of nice to get used to it. Well, good afternoon, everyone, dear colleagues, distinguished guests, distinguished students, thank you so much for being here today and for taking the time to be here today. You didn't have to, but I appreciate it. I also want to thank the University of Lisbon for inviting me, the Institute of Social Sciences specifically, and of course, Professor Filippo. Thank you so much. It's truly an honor. I don't take these invitations lightly, and before accepting, actually, I went on your website to try and see if your ethos aligned with mine, and it did. So I appreciate that, and I thank you for the work that you do. Before I start, actually, I wanted to say a few words. I was reading on LinkedIn, social media, sorry. I was reading on LinkedIn somebody posting something in the UK about currently some vans going around in the UK and trying to round up what they called illegal immigrants. And I don't know, it was maybe a couple of hours ago, and I kept thinking, this is extraordinary. So here I am in Lisbon, and I'm reading about a UK government, but it's not just the government, the UK, rounding up people. That is happening in Lisbon, in Portugal. It's happening literally in any European capital. And why is it extraordinary, beside the fact that it's quite cruel? It's that I've been working for several decades on the histories of European colonialism and the fact that Europe has come, Europe went 500 years ago illegally because they were not invited to go, and settled in those places and stayed for 500 years. Anyway, that's not how I wanted to start my presentation, so I'm just going to go straight to the point. Oh yes, I'm not told you anything technical. Is it? Oh, it's this one. Okay, so before I start, I want to tell you a bit more about the cover. And the cover is a Catalan painter called Joseph Tapiro. And it's interesting because he's an extraordinary painter. I mean, this is, I had many women, particularly women, telling me how handsome this young man is. He's dead, but that's fine, he's still handsome. And I was struck by that and the fact that nobody knows what his name was. And I started thinking about the fact that most models, nobody knew who they were. We rarely have their names. And that reminds me of what the scholar Cedric Robinson calls racial capitalism. It means using race and black bodies in particular to generate wealth. Well, before Robinson, that was the whole point of transatlantic enslavement. Now, this lecture is not about the history of enslavement and how Europe built its wealth by exploiting extra-European populations. That story deserves a whole lecture on its own. Today I'm going to talk about histories that intersect with that history. I'm going to talk about the European gaze and its links with African Europeans' histories. So in the last 5 decades or so, many believe that migration of people of African descent was a new phenomenon. However, those who had been fond of the arts seem to know much more about the stories of migration and encounters, precisely through the arts. The arts seem to have been telling those stories all along, even when they have been forgotten or erased from mainstream books or certain history books. Art lovers know that encounters led to interesting forms of representations, and those included sculptures, paintings, drawings, and so on. And speaking of history books, the vast majority of people tended to focus on the slave trade or the history of enslavement, the colonial era, or the post-World War migration, for example. There's nothing, absolutely nothing wrong with that. But there is a longer and much more complex history of European gaze on people of African descent that reveal incredible stories and journeys. And I think it's important for me to start by the question of positioning, because one may wonder why I chose to work on stories about people of African descent, and yet, through the European gaze, or rather using arts and European arts, grandmaster paintings, for example. Isn't that ironically adopting a Eurocentric approach? Ironic because I am a woman of African descent, after all. Well, it is and it isn't. Let me explain. As a person of African descent, living in the global north, can I strictly qualify as a global south intellectual? My approach is resolutely global north-led because of my background. Filipa explained about me being educated in Paris. My education, and that brings with it many forms of privileges. Again, let me clarify by going through my background, but before I do, let me say that I am embracing all these layers and complexities, even the ambiguity my position seemed to highlight. Embracing one's position in this space here is for me about shifting power dynamics. Me, a woman of African descent, born in Cameroon, whose ancestors may have been trafficked to this city, is claiming that I am resolutely African European. And by the way, those who don't know about Cameroon, the name Cameroon was given by the Portuguese, Rios dos Cameroons. That's about the extent of my Portuguese for today. So I claim an identity that is not necessarily accepted by everybody. It is an identity that has been defined by both Africa and Europe. Europe and Africa, as you know, are a geographical and social construct that were developed over centuries and solidified by colonial conquest. Europe was constructed and continues to be constructed in opposition to Africa and the rest of the world. Historically, though, the concept of Europe was not as clear-cut as it is today. At the time, 15th, 16th century, even before that, one spoke of kingdoms. For example, the Kingdom of France. One spoke of dynasties or dynasties, the Habsburg, for example, or the Bourbon dynasty. So even my using the term African European is a political decision, and it's playing to those contrasts and understood layers of complexities. The second reason why the question of the gaze and positioning matters in writing this book is because, to quote white Catholic French man, Michel de Certeau, there are problems with that, but I like some aspect of Michel's research. I'm actually fascinated by the silences, the glaring silences that shape European history when it comes to the histories of people of African descent. Those silences leave residues that are left floating on the outskirts of the discursive field of power. Those residues are lurking on the edges of society's cultural memory, and sometimes they are visible through cultural practices. They are apparent through exoticized representations of black bodies. I mentioned the discursive field of power. Well, to bring about a Foucauldian term, and yes, I do have problems with Michel Foucault, but you know, I grew up in France and you use certain canons, but I do have problems with Michel Foucault. So to bring Foucault to the mix, those residues, meaning those silences, are always present on the outskirts. They reveal power dynamics, amnesia about the past, the invisibility, and at the same time, the hyper-visibility of black women in Western and global North societies. They are about power dynamics, who holds power, who wields power over people's bodies. Those silences are residues. They are gendered and racialized. They are about what has been named the double jeopardy by feminist writer Frances M. Beale. The double jeopardy of being a woman being a black woman in certain spaces. In her essay called To Be Black and a Woman. So this is the base of the background analysis that led me to try and tackle the question by not moving away from those reductive, racist, sexist power stances, but actually by leaning further on them to reveal what is actually lacking, what those paintings are telling us about European societies. It is because of grandmaster paintings and gazes and their representation of black people that I got intrigued as a 13-year-old growing up in France, where you were forced to go to museums and look at these, what is supposed to be representing European or Europe grandeur. These paintings show aspects that are important to understand Europeans' various historical, social, psychological, political, economic stances and perceptions about Africa and people of African descent. Of course, I cannot tackle all these layers fully, and I cannot do them justice. But come with me on this journey for a few minutes. It is because of several trajectories that I felt compelled to write a book I called African Europeans. The title is a provocation. It echoes African Americans, but in a different way. Because the term African Americans is accepted, not necessarily understood, but accepted by most. We don't really challenge it every day. So I thought, what if I did the same for Europe? Let's see. Well, I can tell you I've been challenged lots. So the provocation is going beyond encounters. It is about how the gaze, the European gaze, shape identities, distorted views, or provided settings for those identities to be transformed. A few years ago, I think it was in 2011, I co-edited a volume, and in the introduction I explained how discrimination shaped identities. So European perceptions have shaped what is perceived to be European identities as much as it has shaped what is perceived to be allegedly African identities in Europe. I said perceived and allegedly because it is much more complicated than that. And we would have to delve into the very notion of identity here. That requires another presentation. You've noticed I invited myself twice already here. So, and I'm also sure that, you know, the sociologists in this room would make a better contribution, to be fair. So to come back to why I wrote the book, I wanted to provocatively start with the Roman Empire because it seems to be the key to the so-called identity, or rather it has been chosen to be the starting point for discussions about the superiority of Europe over the rest of the world. We are all familiar with Europe's, and by extension, Hollywood's fascination with the Roman Empire. I can't really remember how many versions there are of the movie Gladiators nowadays. So I chose the Roman Empire because it is, in my opinion, an example of a very well curated memory of the past that has been made public and became collective. It is a memory of the past that has become a history that is transmitted, taught outside the classroom, through public representations, through movies, visual arts, and so on. Those representations have cemented the notion of a European identity that is, or that was allegedly born with the Romans and sometimes with the Greeks. What is interesting is that my friend and the American philosopher Cornel West wrote about this notion of a well-curated past. He noted that, for example, the invention of beauty canons in the 18th century, you know, rosy cheeks, pale skin, were seen as being delicate and feminine. He also explained how in the 18th century, ancient Rome was turning to the cradle of European civilization, the height of sophistication, when, as historians, we know that the Roman Empire was also brutal and couth in many ways. Yes, they paved the roads, they have colosseums, they had a brilliant, complex legal system, but they were also terrible with the sewers. They took pleasure in torturing and turning executions into a grand spectacle. So is that called civilization? With that in mind, I wanted to turn to ancient Rome, but to look at the construction of a myth, a building of a collective narrative that functions as a mise en abîme, meaning a place that reproduces its own processes, excluding what doesn't fit the narrative. The best way I found to describe the idea of mise en abîme of historical narrative is through paintings. Here is the painting of Johannes Gump. Okay, I'm not very fond of him, but actually I like that painting and the idea of mise en abîme. Is himself, looking at himself, representing himself. I mean, that is totally narcissistic, isn't it? I quite like that. It is, of course, a powerful metaphor for me of how we chose, or we choose, we write about and transmit certain histories over others, and how we turn those histories into canons. In the UK, they talk about the classics. Well, French-Bulgarian historian Svetlana Tudorov talked about the legitimizing the past, and he analyzed what he called the sacralization of history. So basically what he's saying is, because it happened a long time ago, centuries ago, the moment, the event, the views are put on a pedestal and turned into a truth or a sacred viewpoint. What could have been mere opinions becomes accepted and sacred because, well, it was shared by people in the past. So if the 18th century tells us that the beauty canon is rosy cheeks, pale skin, and if, to kind of support that allegation, it says, look, the Romans also had that, then in the 21st century, we believe that what beauty should look like, because it's happened in the past, so we're sacralizing this as well. After all, that has been the case for centuries, or so we're made to believe. Please don't misunderstand me. Rosy cheeks and pale skin can be beautiful, but so can dark brown skin. So to make the color of the skin a prerequisite for beauty in the 18th century, right in the middle of an era that posited people of African descent as subhuman, is and was problematic. Anyway, those processes of curative memories, sacralization of the past are also exclusionary and can be used as tools. In fact, they have been used as tools to shape national narratives. I'm thinking about French historian Ernest Renan and how, working with the politician Jules Ferry, they made the French school compulsory, but they also curated a school curriculum that taught French children that they were conquerors and they were racially superior. And all that in the 19th century, a time when colonization was in place, a time when we see the birth of the so-called scientific racism, a time when we see eugenics. So the gaze of the painters in those eras does and did matter. Sacralization went through those visual representations. So when you look at a painting, there's much more that is at play here. And I wanted to add that exclusion and sacralization led to a very specific kind of memory that becomes part of people's identities. Sacralization leads to remembering through commemorations, practices, customs that also become part of national identity. This is what cultural memory is made of. I'm inviting you, and I'm talking again to many sociologists here, but for those who are not, I'm inviting you to read Jan and Aleida Assmann. So let us look at these characters then. I keep talking about painters and what it is, and what is the link between them, people of African descent, and Europeans. Well, now that I've given you another context, a few points in writing history and the colonial stances that shape European gazes, I would like us to look at the representations of those I called African Europeans. Some of you might have heard of the legend of Saint Maurice. Well, Saint Maurice was a soldier born in the Theban region, which is nowadays Egypt. He was also a Roman soldier because in the 3rd century, the Roman army controlled territories that expanded from nowadays Egypt and Libya. and upwards in the north of Italy, and upwards again. It is thought that Maurice enrolled in the Theban Legion posted there. He was allegedly sent to crush an insurrection in the Gaul. And as a commander of the Roman troops, he was asked to ensure that these troops paid tribute and their dues to the god Jupiter before battle, as was required by all Roman soldiers. He initially agreed, but then he changed his mind for reasons that may have been linked to religious freedom. And the Emperor Maximian sent troops to arrest Maurice and his loyal soldiers. Now, Maurice's origins have been the source of extensive scholarship. Some of the references are in my book if you want to learn more about him. And most volumes tend to look at the legend's transformation over time, but a more modest number of studies examine its basis. Maurice's legend grew as a martyr and expanded and reached the Rhine region, which is nowadays Germany. And by the 13th century, Magdeburg in Germany decided to erect a statue of St. Maurice. It is a statue of a black man that has been there since the 13th century. Because for many people, Maurice symbolizes bravery, Christianity, and defiance against oppression. Maurice is well known, but there were other people of African descent who play key roles in European settings under the Roman rule. In fact, the Roman Empire counts a long list of prestigious African Europeans who had positions amongst the powerful. For example, the powerful Cornelius Fronto, a grammarian, also of African descent, who became an influential educator and who was appointed to be the personal tutor of not just one person, but two people who became Roman emperors. And some of them I know Lucius Verus, but most of you probably know Marcus Aurelius. Now, in terms of the gaze of the representation of Maurice, in all depictions, Maurice is represented as an African, and his features have been kept. Stefan Lochner's Altarpiece, Rogier van der Weyden, and later on Albrecht Dürer's Adoration of the Magi. Now, they bring the story of the three Magi together with the figure of St. Maurice. In each of these paintings, one of the three Magi, he's either Caspar Balthazar, has become a Berber, a Moor, or a black African. I looked at so many paintings that are more or less similar. There are so many in the 15th century. And the veneration of the Magi and that of Maurice are merged into Lochner's painting where an African is seen carrying the Maurice flag. Balthazar appeared as a black magus in several paintings, such as the work of Bartholomeus Brun the Elder and other masters in the 16th century, while Maurice appears again in Matthias Grunewald's depiction of the meeting of SS Erasmus and Maurice. The veneration of both Maurice and the Magi continued and led to numerous local representations of these figures in nowadays Germany, but also but elsewhere. And incidentally, Dürer was working while he was working on the Magi, his interest in people of African descent was evident in other paintings and other drawings. For example, we have a beautiful drawing of a young 20 years old woman called Catarina. We don't know if she was enslaved or not. She's said to have been a Moro from North Africa, but she could have been from Central West Africa. She might have been a servant. What we do know, though, is that she was living in Antwerp with a Portuguese merchant called Brandão. So these images were tailored to different audiences. Catarina was an extraordinary figure because she was, drawn by Dürer, a master painter. But actually, she was an ordinary, everyday woman of African descent in Antwerp in the 15th century. There is no artifice in the portrait. The portrait is not catering to the wealthy, the curious. It is about an artist sharpening his skills with a kind of model that are not generally presented like that. Barefaced and perhaps honestly represented here. It's interesting because this is the kind of drawing and paintings that are not famous. She's not artificial, glorified. These representations of origins, appearance, and color in medieval and early modern art could be interpreted as an acceptance of otherness. Alongside such representation, the equation of blackness with evil in that period seemed to be linked to the idea of morality rather than black Africans. What I'm trying to say is that blackness was not necessarily linked to evil at the time. So far, I've been showing you mostly images of men. We need to change that. My book, African European, came, as I said, in 2020. One of the things that I noticed is that I kept being asked about ancient female figures. I was never asked to start with the Queen of Meroe or the Kandak of Meroe. Most people wanted to know about, generally, they wanted to know about women, but not so much. They wanted to know more about Maurice the soldier, the military, etc. And sometimes they wanted to know about Septimius Severus, and I'll talk about him later. So this point really echoes a problem I encountered while working on the book, which was, where were the female voices, and how do I make sure that they were heard? We know of powerful rulers, such as indeed the Kandak of Meroe, but how about the female legendary figures equivalent to Maurice? So I wanted to talk about somebody who's not that much talks about, and she doesn't appear in European paintings as often as St. Maurice, and that is the Queen of Sheba. She appears mostly in Ethiopian art and paintings and in studies of the Bible and the Quran. She also appears in both, for some of you who are familiar with the Bible, she appears in 1 Kings, in 2 Chronicles of the Hebrew Bible, and in the Surat of the Quran, Surat 27. Here you see 2 different images of the Queen, and interestingly enough, the one now in Ethiopia is said to date back to the 17th century. There doesn't seem to be an earlier representation, and yet it was there that the Queen seemed to have been an earlier inspiration to many. In the Hebrew Bible, she is presented as a wealthy queen who learnt about King Solomon's reputation in wealth and decided to test his wisdom. In the Quran, it is Solomon who received a report about the Queen of Sheba and threatened to invade her land if she and her subject did not stop worshipping their various gods. And both stories are about conversion to a religion and submission to God's will. In the New Testament, her name is changed to the Queen of the South. Some of you may be familiar with the Netflix series Queen of the South, but never mind. Totally different queen. Anyway, further transformations of the story are about to be found in the Aramaic version of the book of Este, where Solomon sent Hupobers to the queen, commanding her to travel to his place. These legends and these stories are really important. So the encounter is given a twist when, while crossing a glass floor, she thought it was a pool, and she pulls up her garment and shows her hairy legs. From that moment, Sheba was associated with demons because body hair was typically attributed to men or demons. I don't know. I can't make the jump, men are demons, it's too easy, isn't it? But that was what they believed at the time. Hairy legs, hairy body, you're a man or a demon. In this case, it also indicates that foreign women who worshipped different gods were seen as dangerous for the family structure and to social order, as it was a woman's role to oversee the education of children and their well-being in the family. So the representations of the Queen of Sheba in European art is also displays an interesting interpretations of otherness. According to many medieval readings of Songs, it was the Queen of Sheba who declared to Solomon, "I am black and beautiful." However, in the 13th century, sculpture of the Queen at St. Anne Portal of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, King Solomon and St. Peter surround her, and they are all the same color, which could be just the color of the stone, but they are all white. Later, in Lavina Fontana's painting, the visit of the Queen of Sheba, She's again white, if you can see it from that painting. So the fluidity of the colour of the queen plays into the perception that otherness may not have mattered in instance when the Africans were on top of the social ladder. It's okay for her to be black or white as long as she's wealthy, basically. The following century, stories about the encounter between Sheba and Solomon mingled Jewish and Muslim traditions. Sometimes she was presented as being half snake, half woman, trying to seduce men and ruin their lives. And another twist is that in some of the stories, the queen is half snake and she's equated to Lilith. Lilith, some of you know, Lucifer's wife. So she's been transformed into, in literature, in European canons and literature canons. In the 19th century literature, they also used her. For example, French novelist Flaubert, La Confession de Saint-Antoine, you have a representation that you can see there. So the representation, she's seen as being, she has the features of a dual heritage woman, and that reminds us of Baudelaire's depiction of his muse Jeanne Duval as being lascivious and exotic. I can't move away from my education. We were, Baudelaire's poetry was shoved into our head. He was the greatest painter. What was interesting is that he wrote a lot about his mistress, Jeanne Duval, who was from a dual heritage, black, white, Caribbean. So it's interesting that Baudelaire presented her as exotic. He talks about temptation. So we move from hairy legs, troublemaker for the family, temptress. There's even a poem called The Dancing Serpent, so again the reference to half snake, Now, I could, of course, spend some time telling you all about other women presented in European art and who had religious influences. But I just wanted to show you how the narrative is transformed and how women are presented, but also how that works the same way with exoticized women. I could indeed talk about Black Madonnas and their roles in European art, and in particular Our Lady of Montserrat, or the Virgin of Montserrat in Catalonia, in Spain, or Poland. I didn't plan to talk about each one of these Madonnas in my book, but they are very intriguing and they serve several functions. The Black Madonnas are supposed to provide protection. Many of them are seen, allegedly, possess healing powers. They are supposed to protect, and people, go to pilgrimage to see those Madonnas. They seek spiritual healing or even guidance. What is interesting, though, is that they call Black Madonnas, but they don't really refer to women of African descent. It's almost as if the African part of them has been removed. The Black Madonnas, the European Black Madonnas, and therefore they're Europeans. So there's rarely a challenge about their Africanity in those settings. They're just mysterious, they're just there. They have even become symbols of national identities and regional identities. So you have, for example, the Black Madonna of Częstochowa, who is a symbol of Polish national identity and even a symbol of resistance. You have Our Lady of Montserrat, who's patron saint of Catalonia, as I mentioned, and that is interesting. They're powerful women, but again, the Africanity of them is not rarely mentioned, actually. These are human contradictions. There are about 400 statues of Black Madonnas across Europe, the Middle East and Africa, 200 in Europe, roughly. You find them in Brazil, obviously, but also in Mexico City. I've seen a few of them. And these Madonnas tell us something crucial regarding European religious trajectories and the place of Black women in Christian church from the 12th to the 13th century and onwards. But Black Madonnas, again, deserve a presentation. Yeah, you know what I'm going to say. Invite me back, tell you all about them. Now, I mentioned Septimius Severus previously, and I won't dwell on him, but I can't help but share these images. of a rather fierce African emperor. Well, most of them were fierce. But he was born in Leptis Magna, which is nowadays Libya. Some of you might have heard of his conquest, and in particular the conquest of Britannia. And he died in a town called York, which is in the north of England. Well, I kid you not, his story is never taught or rarely taught in British schools. In the north of England, people know about him, but the rest of the country, he's not talked about, or when he's talked about, nobody mentioned the fact that he was an African, or African-born. And these images are quite interesting. This is what the British Museum said about them. They called them the Severin Tongo, a panel painting from roughly 200 AD, and it depicts Septimius Severus with his wife, Julia Domna, and their two sons that you can't see properly. And Severus's family accompanied him to Britain in 208. So it is important to remember that they have been part of, Africans have been part of European visual arts for a very long time. Fast forward, because there are many characters, 14th century, we have the story of Alessandro de' Medici. Some of you might know him. He was the second cousin of Pope Clement IV, and he belonged to the very prestigious and well-known de' Medici family. Some of you might have seen, the Medici, the series that I can't even describe, doing terrible things and plotting. Yeah, I love this stuff, so yeah. Well, Alexandra is said to have been of dual heritage and also known as mixed race. His mother was a black African woman, and he became the very first Duke of Florence, a powerful republic in the south of Europe. And in his early 20s, he was assassinated by his jealous cousin when he was 27 years old, actually, in 1537. There's a lot to be said about his life, but one of the main things I found really fascinating was the way he was represented. So scholar John Brackett uses portraits of Alexandro to show how his image and interpretations of his origins varied. All the representations were made after his death. In 1534, portrait by Giorgio Vasari shows a duke whose features are, and you can see them there, the features are closer to that of a man of European descent, with an aquiline nose, thinner lips, although he still has curly hair and brown skin. A miniature, as you can see there, a miniature from Agnolo Bronzino's workshop, painted after 1553, represents Alexandro with curly hair and African features. 1585, a portrait from the workshop of Girolamo Macchetti. He's richly dressed and his features remain relatively similar to their representation in the previous portrait. So, despite these disparities, Brackett argues that Alexandra's mother's ethnicity was not the object of attack against him. In other words, it wasn't because he was, of African descent that they attacked him. They attacked him because he was a cruel tyrant, a monster for some people. And I engaged with Alexandra's story because it was interesting as well how over the years the paintings became whiter and whiter. And so that speaks to a discomfort, and because obviously they were all represented after his death. Now, something else that was interesting for me as a young woman, teenager growing up in Paris, was we studied at length another canon, so-called canon of French literature, which was Alfred de Musset, Lorenzaccio, which was a play I adored, and as a maybe 15-year-old, I never knew Lorenzaccio Lorenzo, based on Alessandro, was actually of dual heritage. Never mentioned that in my entire life. It took me writing this book to actually find out. There are other key people I wanted to tell you more about. Somebody called Juan Latino, a scholar from Granada in the 16th century, but we have no portrait of him. So let's move on to the dangerous waters of 18th century. I trained as an 18th century historian. And I wanted to talk about 18th century's theologian and intellectual, Jacobus Kapitein, also brought to the Netherlands as a child and enslaved. Look at the portrait. Magnificent, dignified, presented as a scholar, looking at us, almost majestic. As with Latino, religion, opportunities, and identity shaped Capitain's journey. He was the product of European education, benefited from the privileges bestowed upon those who viewed him as exceptional. He was also the medium through which the European elite attempted to implement their civilizing aspiration. What do I mean by that? Well, he was taken from Shama, which is nowadays Ghana, as a child, and he was offered to a sea captain, a Dutchman, and the Dutchman offered him to another Dutchman who worked for the Dutch West India Company, which would be the equivalent of the Google of today, very wealthy companies. And he was then taken to The Hague, where he was given an education. And he traveled with somebody called Van Gogh, and Van Gogh had not Vincent, the other Van Gogh, had a house. And 2 years after his arrival, he was sent to a German-born minister of the Reformed Church called Johann Philipp Menger. And Menger's impression of the boy was really important. So picture this. We are in the 1730s. The Dutch Republic is at its height. It has challenged the Portuguese and the Spanish. They're following in the footsteps of those countries, of those kingdoms. And they want a piece of the world, just like the Portuguese and the Spanish were. So they ruthless, even more so. And they went after any holdings that these countries had across the globe. So the Dutch were very proud of their achievements. And through Capitain's writing, we learned that The Hague in the country was a source of national or regional pride and esteem. So, and the position is that you have to remember, this is a child who's been raised to believe of the fact that the Dutch were the most important in the world. And he was part of that, you know. So, and he was provided an education. In today's term, we would say that he was groomed, actually. So 1735, when he's nearly 18 years old, he was baptized and sent to the very prestigious University of Leiden 2 years later, because he shows aptitude. He seems to be incredibly intelligent, learning fast, and so on. So in 1742, he rose to prominence because he defended a thesis called, and that is where he was seen as a prodigy. And the title of the thesis was Political Theological Dissertation Concerning Slavery as Not Contrary to Christian Freedom. So what he's basically saying, he's arguing that enslaved men and women should be baptized, but he contended that they should not. It doesn't mean that it should lead to emancipation. The ultimate goal of all people was leading a Christian life. Some people might say, oh, that's terrible. But I'm actually very fond of Capitaine because, once again, this is a child who has been groomed to ignore the color of his skin, to ignore who he was. He had servants around him, but he was told that he was different. He was a genius, which he was. And therefore, you know, asking people to renounce that is very difficult. But also the fact that he was convinced, he was raised by religious people, so he was convinced that salvation should come, well, basically when you're dead. You know, you go to heaven and then you're free. So, but that viewpoint was dismantled by himself when he decided, he was convinced to go back to Africa, West Africa, and to try and convince other people that Christianity was the way forward. So imagine this, he arrived in West Africa with all his degrees, intelligence, supported by the Dutch West India Company. And on the African coast, what he's going to encounter are colonists who are alcoholic, uneducated, and utterly racist. And that really is a downfall because they're going to make his life hell, living hell. So much so that he died in utter and abject poverty in the West African coast, completely abandoned by his Dutch protectors. And while that was happening in the Netherlands, another African European took center stage in French history. We indeed have the story of the amazing master fencer and music prodigy, Joseph Boulogne, known as Chevalier de Saint-Georges. He was the son of a plantation owner, an enslaved woman. His father wanted to give him the education of a gentleman, of a nobleman, so he took him to Paris and paid for the best teachers, and I mean the best teachers in the realm, from fencing to music to all kinds of education. And his life is going to take on an interesting turn because he is an aristocrat. He's very friendly with Marie Antoinette. There's been suggestion that, but I'm not sure. I was in there. Anyway, so things are happening. Everything's going fantastic for him. He's an incredible sportsman. He's intelligent, and it depends on your taste, but I find him rather dashing. And yes, I'm half in love with a dead man, but yeah, that's fine. So he's working across Europe. He's commissioning work from Joseph Handel, the great classical musician. He's known by everybody. He's writing plays. He even wrote a play about a transgender spy, a noble person called Chevalier Léon. And that would be my next book, by the way. In the end, what he's going to do, renouncing his privileges, he's going to decide to follow the revolutionary. Utter mistake, for him at least. He follows the revolutionary, sets up the first regiment of people of African descent in France, and he wants liberation. He believes that the revolutionary are going to provide freedom for people of African descent, but they don't really see him that way. What he forgot is that he's still an aristocrat, and they're still wary of him, and they're still wary of the fact that he's also of African descent. So they are going to imprison him twice. And when he came out really ill, and when Napoleon came back into power and reestablished, France, the revolutionary had abolished slavery in 1794. Napoleon came back into power, reestablished slavery, and Napoleon is going to make sure that all his music is removed. You can imagine, he was a superstar at the time. So Napoleon is going to make everything he could to remove his music from all repertoires. And he's more or less forgotten, but not completely, because his music could be found in the Caribbean and in other places across Europe. So it's only in 2014 that the French state, at a very moving ceremony, and I'm going to say this, I tend to not share my political views, although you might guess they're rather on the left side of things. The French President François Hollande, who I can say I wasn't very fond of, but reinstate the Chevalier de Saint-Georges at a very official ceremony in 2014. His music was played by the Garde Républicaine, and it means that France is recognizing him as a master fencer, as a classical musician, 18th century classical musician. So the gaze of enslaved people of African descent did not dramatically shift from the 18th to the 19th century, and yet representation in European art functioned at different levels. You have the iconography of the abolition of slavery, and I've chosen this British iconography because it's quite interesting. For some people it's not art, but I just wanted to mention the fact that a man, 18th century man of taste and sensibility, is the man who has adopted the brooch, the cameo, the teacups that abolitionists have been promoting in the 18th century. So it became fashionable to be an abolitionist in the 18th century. And these was produced by William Hapgood and made by the potter Josiah Wedgwood. And it's really interesting because this medallion that nowadays we would consider to be extraordinarily paternalistic, white saviorism, if you want to use the more contemporary term, was incredibly popular in the 18th century. A minor brother and a man. Fast forward, 1807, the slave trade was abolished by the British Parliament, and Britain was at war with, guess who? Napoleon again. So Britain and its allies won the war, so Napoleon was forced to accept the term of the victory, and in 1815, so some of which were that all European nations had to stop the trade. So whole debates were done about the moral versus the economic reasons why Britain stopped the slave trade. But what I just wanted to say is that while this is happening, it's in 19th century, the long 18th century, so the 19th century, other things were happening in the 19th century. 18th century, you have the 7 Years' War, you have London becoming a business capital, you have the Durban Act that limits the number of enslaved people in those ships, you have the Waterloo, you have scientific racism, you have that argues that people of African descent were biologically subhuman. And then you have the world of the arts presenting those Africans as being exotic, richly clothed, dignified in some ways. So you have Marie-Diamine Benoit's portrait renamed Portrait of Madeleine. So obviously the woman is exoticized, sexualized. You can look at her, she's gazing sideways, almost sad, and that was captured by the artist. The portrait was bought by King Louis XVIII in 1818, a timely portrait that told the story of France's turmoil and engagement in the slave trade. So France abolished the slave trade in 1848, so you have the contradiction in there. So we can say that artists and painters at the time were perhaps social commentators. And then we have Géricault working on the portrait of a young woman. Again, this is a powerful painting. It's very beautiful. She's presented as a North African woman, although some studies suggest that she was actually Central Africa. So she's exoticized, a Berber, so to speak. And then we have this one, and it's really Géricault is one of my favorite painters, but I wanted to look at this because the portrait is also on the cover of one of my books. So it's called Portrait of Joseph, painted in 1818. We can't help but be struck by the intensity of the gaze, piercing, looking at an object away from us, mesmerized. The painter is mesmerized. Because the same year, Géricault produced the famous Raft of the Medusa that you can see behind me. And that told the story of a shipwreck, a story about how incompetence led to disaster, a story about starvation and death, and the story of France at the time, a story that shook France at the time. So those histories of Britain and France's involvement in the slave trade or human trafficking are not just about 2 or 3 countries. They are about a European story, a construction of a common identity as much as it is about rivalry and wealth. And what is interesting for me is that within that bigger story of colonization and so on and so forth, there are always those people who think, oh, they were not part of that story. And they claimed for a long time they were not part of the story. And those who claim that are Scandinavian countries. So, I wanted to share the story of Nordic involvement. One figure remains inscribed into the Swedish collective memory in relation to perceptions of black body is Pierre-Louis Alexandre. So he was born in French Guyana, 1844, 4 years prior to the French abolition. He arrived in Stockholm in 1863 when he was just 19 years old. After working on the docks, he became a very popular model of the Swedish Academy of Fine Arts. The striking terracotta head that you see here, sculpted by Werner Ackermann. 1885, we see here a black man in his 40s with a slightly receding hairline, a few wrinkles, smiling lightly, looking sideways. And Ackermann won a royal medal and a scholarship for this piece of art that he entitled, guess what? Sambo. And Sambo would be the equivalent of an N-word today. Sambo was a derogatory term in the 19th century. Extraordinary. So Pierre-Louis was routinely exoticized in portrait by other artists. He was a very popular model. Seen everywhere, carrying sometimes a sword, a long knife, yellow turban, bare chest, and so on. He appeared in numerous attires that are supposed to represent Africa, and yet we know he never set foot in Africa. We know very little of him, but we do know that he never set foot in Africa. And he helped many of the artists win many medals, scholarships. Again, an example of racial capitalism I mentioned earlier. However, in addition to these representations, 19th century Sweden also saw a proliferation of colonial discourses in historical and geographical writing. So it's not just Sweden, it's across Europe that you see that. Remember, 19th century is also the century of Zwarte Piet, blackface in the Netherlands, and so on and so forth. So a lot is happening while they're presenting people of African descent like that. So I would like to conclude on a few points. The stories of African European is a history of resilience, encounters, trauma, collaborations, and also friendship and exchanges. It is a story that is at the core of European identities that is not often shared. I want to thank you for the opportunity to share some of it here today, and I want to encourage people to turn to those work of art, not just as beautiful artistic expression or examples of the artist's skills, but as canvases for storytelling. They represent perceptions. They are transmitting a type of knowledge that shapes our perceptions of people of African descent. They are fantasized versions of people. They are eroticized versions. They are unwilling commentaries of various era. They teach us about what is said, but most importantly, what is not said, the absences. I'm inviting you to reflect on how they shape each one of your perceptions about your own national identity. I'm ending with this, which is the cover of my translated book. Each cover tells a very distinct story about relationship with paintings, but each one also tells you about the model, how they were embedded in a community of survivors. They symbolize Black liberation and resilience. I'm inviting you to follow the crumbs and try and find out more about themselves. But I want to end on another note. It's all very good, I like you and everything. I guess being in this institute means that you are not racist, I'm hoping. But I want you to go a bit further. I want you to become anti-racist. Anti-racism is about active resistance. It's not just about saying, I don't have anything against people of African or Asian descent or extra-European population. It's about actually making a stand. It's about being more active than that. It's about speaking up when you see racism and prejudice. It's about engaging in the discussions that are happening right now. It's also about sometimes understanding that it's not about you positioning yourself at the front of the fight. Sometimes being the backup dancer is also good, but it's always being engaged. So be an anti-racist, please. Thank you.
Again, we went from the past to the present. And now we have around 10 minutes for questions and answers. So please, we can do so in English, French, we are lucky that our guests knows the language, I think even German. But if you want to do it in Portuguese, I'll do it. So please come.
I know it was a lot of talking, so I appreciate those of you leaving. Thank you for staying. And those of you who are here, I can understand that you're taking it in, so you're processing, as one might say.
Yes. So here, all right. So, Karin.
Thank you so much, Olivette, for this marvelous and interesting talk. I just have two questions. One is, when you analyze these works of art, do you get any sense of the enslaved communities that actually were in Europe at the time? So other people, other communities. And the second question is, when you look at the works of art, can you find any echo of this in literature? And, well, I'm sure there is a lot of literature because Filipa actually told us to look at literature today. I think maybe you have some ideas. And lastly, when you say that as academics we should take a stand, how would you say that at present European academia is trying to take a stand on racism? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so the first one was how embedded they were in their communities. Actually, what I decided to do is look at the question of exceptionalism that I study in the book. So I go from those that we know, the paintings and all this stuff, to try and show that actually they would never have been able to survive without their communities. And in the book, what I try to do is, obviously, they're not speaking for their communities. However, they're representing a pattern of behavior, a setting, and so each character actually is embedding their communities. And the practices of exceptionalism, which are, so you choose one, and you put him on the pedestal like Jacobus. It's also a process of exclusion. It means that he's, how can I put it? He's different from his peers, and therefore his peers, which is the majority, are subhuman. In other words, by putting one on a pedestal, you're telling the others that, well, this is the creme of the creme, and therefore the others are, well, basically rubbish. So exceptionalism plays at different levels. And I have to say, exceptionalism is also when I became the first black woman to be a history professor in the United Kingdom in 2018. For me, it was exceptionalism. I was put on this pedestal, which tell other people that, you know, she's the top of the top, but the rest of you cannot really achieve that, when it's also about opportunities, always about opportunities. So there's that. The second question was about literature. Well, obviously, literature is my go-to. I actually wanted to. I was planning to do a PhD on literature, but I decided to go for history for activist reasons. Every time that you find one of those paintings, you will find a so-called canon, and you will find a mention. I don't know. I mentioned Lorenzaccio. I mentioned all these plays. But I'm trying to figure out, do you have a specific era in mind? Any? 19th century. Well, if we talk about British literature, all the Jane Austen's novels are about these characters, aren't they? And there are mentions of enslavement. Even when there's no mention, we have Charles Dickens, who does not mention particularly race, but we know, and Thackeray, we know that they were, I can say it now, they were incredible racists, because outside they were writing stuff that were related to people of African descent and enslaved people. So there's a context in there where literature, even when they're not seen, these people are producing stuff outside that are actually cemented the prejudice that they had about people of African descent. So the third question was about academia. Academia, it's interesting because they're almost like several camps or several groups in academia. There's the scholarly activists who are actually either working with people outside academia to try and fight for social and racial justice and gender justice. And you also have people who are actively trying to prevent that. We have that in the UK. They're very visible. Those groups are very visible. And you also have people who are the silent majority, and those are the ones I'm appealing to. The silent majority considered it as academics. We're not supposed to get engaged into these questions because we're doing serious work. I do believe that as academics, if you're working on medieval history, some people have told me in the past, I'm working on medieval history, what do you want me to say about race? I said, listen, medieval history is where the invention of race, medieval history is about race as a location, race as a religion, race as the color. So there are ways to get engaged. And if you really believe that it's not your job as an academic, put your academic hat on the side and engage as a human being. I think that is valid too, So I hope I answered. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this very fine presentation. It was very important for me as a black woman to know these people that lived in the European continent for so long time. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, it's about for one side the way that are represented. You talked about a little bit about tokenism, about the sexual exploitation of women and men, and also the negative prejudice that is associated with these personalities in the way they are represented. But also I wanted to, because I read it in the book, and I don't know if it is linked with your presentation, but the restrictions that were put to black people in Europe as a continuity with the restrictions that we are assisting today in Europe, and all these questions that all were active at that in various periods, also active today, the way that black people are presented in the public space or in the media, in the newspapers. We are always presented as criminal or dangerous, or the people that are invading other countries. All these ideas, and I wanted to think like a continuity between that period and if there is a continuity in that period and today.
Thank you. There is continuity. France in 1788 set up what was called La Police des Noirs, which is the police for black people. But France was not the only one to do that. Police des Noirs was basically set up to police the circulation of black bodies in France, but also across Europe. And many examples, many European countries who were associated with colonialism did that in any shape or form. It's basically about containing not only the volume, but also where people of African descent were supposed to be circulating. So this idea of a legacy of the past is one of them, because the continuity was that in the 19th century, the following century, was to actually decide and explain further by saying that they need to be contained because the beasts look, craniology, so-called scientific racism was about that. The beasts look, we measured the heads and we measure supposedly the intelligence, determine intelligence. 19th century was about not so much containing, but make sure that those who have been brought to the continent, European continent, were sent back, and that there was no traveling between the two continents. In other words, you have migration from the north to the south of people of European descent, but little by little migration from the south to the north was more and more contained. Historically, that was what was happening because of these ideas of bestiality, of invasion. 20th century, post-war, post First and Second World War, it was okay to bring them over because they came to fight for the mother countries. The First World War, many, and that's the story across Europe. They came to fight during the First and Second World War, but they needed to go back, and then brought back again to rebuild Europe, again, across the board. And they came, they stayed, but we don't want them here because it's changing European cultural, social landscape. And again, it's the story that we're seeing here is a continuity of what was happening and happened since the 18th century. I think I answered your question.
Thank you so much for this inspiring talk, and it inspired me for a daring question. We have now a history of visibility of personalities of African European personalities. Are we about to witness also a social history of marronage in Europe and resistance and communities that are not visible in history now?
Thank you. But that's a history I've been teaching for 2 decades. So for me, they've always been visible. Resistance is at the core of everything that we do. We can only do so much. But the history of marronage in Europe or outside Europe? In Europe, well, I hope so. I hope that history, I make sure to teach that history in here. It's about black, but I said, personally, it's about black liberation. And the only way to kind of fight against this idea of paternalism or white saviorism that talk more about collaboration and allyship is by showing that people of African descent have always fought for their own liberation, but not alone. You know, it's a history of exchange. And I also think that these stories are slowly emerging. There's resistance, though, to teach those stories, but they're slowly emerging in academia. And I'm thinking in particular of courses across many universities that are called Black Europe, for example, or Black, you find them in Amsterdam, well, we find them in the Netherlands, I don't know about Portugal in academia. No? Well, you should set up a class. Black liberation, black resistance, or you can call it anything else. Just don't be daring. I mean, you might as well, since it's about liberation and marriage. But yeah, well, you could set up one.
Mm-hmm. So, you, Sophia, then, I'm sorry, I didn't notice who was first, but maybe you.
No,
then, all right, sorry, so you first, then Sophia.
Okay, it's okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Otele. I have a question about that resistance that you just brought up in terms of strategy. So I was wondering if you could speak to some advice that you have for researchers who want to link that well-curated past that you discussed with present structures. I think the resistance is sometimes, but it's so much better than it was, and what are we talking about, right? So I wonder if you can speak to the ways that you found that you can bring that strategy or information to present these things and be met in the most receptive ways possible. And especially maybe you could speak to how people could be as allies in this, to frame the question.
Okay,
so because we are running out of time, let's do the 2 other questions first. Yes, and then I'll give you some questions. Okay. Sophia, and then you, and then we'll have the answers.
Okay, I will do a quick question. Yes. First of all, thank you so much. It was fantastic, and congratulations to both of you. Olivette, it was great, and Filipa for introducing you to us at ICS. Quickly, I was wondering, I thought it was really fascinating how you used so many examples in your lecture. I think it was really fascinating. But I was wondering, how was your process of selection of these examples that you gave us today? And I noticed that in some cases, for instance, Black Europeans are kind of representing themselves, like doing their music, doing their literature in the examples you gave us. On other cases, they are being represented by other, perhaps white Europeans. How are you dealing with this kind of difference? Is there any difference? Or for instance, in painting, I guess the majority are Black people being represented in Europe. Have you found, I'm very curious about it, have you found in your research kind of examples of Black European painters or artists that are really doing kind of visual arts? I'm very curious about this. Well, but I'm going to read your books, and thank you again so much.
Thank you so much for your questions, both your questions.
Olivette, thank you for your wonderful presentation. Hello. Well, I'm a Brazilian researcher working with Afro-descendant music style produced here in Lisbon called batida, Batida do Gueto. And in my interviews, I always ask, how do you want to see your music here in Portugal? It's Afro-Portuguese music, is African or Portuguese music? And it surprised me, the diversity of responses. Many of them want that their music be considered Portuguese music. Many of them claim that it's African music, but none of them want to be seen as Afro-Portuguese. And for me as a Brazilian, it's very interesting because in Brazil we have Afro-Brazilian identity well established. So I just want to hear what you think about this.
That's interesting, thank you.
I have another question. Sorry. My name is Madalena. I'm also Cameroonian, so I'm very happy and I truly admire your work. Thank you so much for the presentation. My question actually relates to, I've read your book and I really liked it. And I was actually pretty, I was kind of surprised when I read about the arguments that Germans reoccupied, started the African colonization in the 17th century in Togo, in Cameroon, etc. They recurred to the arguments of the historical legitimization to do the occupation once again. I really like how you explained the argumentation and how you chronologically indicated how that happened. And I couldn't help but to establish the parallel with the Portuguese case, because here I think it's extremely complicated to Portugal to acknowledge, as the researcher Filipa told us at the beginning, to acknowledge the Portuguese colonial past. So I think my question for you is, do you have any advice, because that is the historical argument to legitimize the persistence of racism and discrimination, and even the absence of these curriculums in schools, universities, etc. It's recurring and it's extremely persistent, even in circles who claim to be more open. So yeah, and it's very specific to the Portuguese context, even though it's very recurrent in European context. So I think the Portuguese case is extremely specific, because though they were the first to be responsible to the enslavement of African communities, they do not claim that, but they also claim that being the first to start the great discoveries and stuff. So I think that's my question.
Thank you. Okay, so strategies, allyship, resistance, resilience. I think there are many strategies. I would say that there are several layers. People outside academia who are doing already the work. They're doing work of not just resistance, raising awareness, fighting. These people need to be given the means to do so further by academia. And I'm talking as an academic, because quite often what you see, I don't know if Portugal, that's the case in Portugal, but in the UK, you have academics, mainly racialized as white, who would receive funding to research on people of African descent. But actually, the funding, because of the way universities are set up, is not going to those people. So again, it's an example of racial capitalism in academia. I have been on boards of UKI, which is the funding body in the UK, trying to change things from within. It went really badly, but there are a few wins, which were that some of the funding can go to groups who already have been doing the work for decades, and that funding, very seriously monitored by themselves, can achieve better rather than being led by academics. And another thing that I would say as an academic, obviously, is that although my friend Cornel West says we don't want white face in higher places, it doesn't change anything, we disagree on that. I think we don't want black face in higher places. I disagree slightly with that. True, Obama was the black face in a higher place, it didn't change anything, but it does make a hell of a difference when you're sitting in a committee and you're not the only black person out of 12 people to defend and try a point. a scholar of African descent or Asian descent or South American descent and so on. So having the number in those committees does change something. So I think already hiring some of the PhDs here, not just because they are of African descent, but because you train them and they're supposed to be really good, right? So you hire them in post and you give them a chance, postdocs as well, and then you see a change in mentality because students, there's something that happens really powerfully about the kind of students that you will attract in this institution. So it's one strategy. And I believe that you can work at several levels. So you can work at the kind of, this is a very practical example. And as an academic of African descent, I work at what I call guerrilla warfare, which is knowing at the racism and the racist from within. UK academia, France academia is racist. So you eat them from within, but I can't do it on my own, obviously. And outside, you support any initiative. You don't have to be engaged in them thoroughly, but you have to support them so that they have that visibility. If you're in a position of power, I think that's a strategy. Second question, how did I select and present? It was very hard. Some people I had to remove them from the stories because I didn't have enough information. That was really heartbreaking. I have a mansion, a name, and I don't have enough to go on about, specifically if they were in countryside and I don't have any context. It's also about who wields the power. Sometimes they're represented and sometimes it's rarely that I found when they represent themselves. Very rarely that I found that. Simply because that tells you about the structures of power. 18th, 19th century, even before that, they were not the ones being made visible to present those paintings or that poetry or that narrative. There are very few of them. In fact, I couldn't find any in the 18th. From the 16th to the kind of 19th century, I couldn't find any. Contemporary 20th, 21st century, you can find many painters, but unfortunately. So, like I said at the beginning, instead of moving away from that, I decided, okay, this is what I've got to work with. Let's lean and let's dig deeper into that sentence. Who was there? What did the archives tell us about that environment? And the archives are there because colonizers were very good at documenting. They loved documenting. You know, how many enslaved people they had. They were so proud. That's how I work with the archives. But always challenge the archives because the archives are violence, okay? Sadiq Hartman talked about it, the violence of the archival material. We need to also question that. So, I'm going really fast. Music, Afro-Portuguese. I mean, okay, you know the Brazilian context, so I'm not going to make the parallel, but I do believe that there's something that it speaks to the fact that some people want to be presented always only as Portuguese. I mean, it can be seen as a negative thing, but it's a survival technique. In an environment where some people will only listen to or accept if it's only Portuguese, it's a survival technique. It speaks to the resilience of these populations. So we shouldn't completely, dismiss them. Those who want to present themselves as Africans, there's a reclaiming of their identity in an environment that denies them that. Both are valid, I believe. Thank you. Historical argument. Legitimization. Oh, I can't even read myself. Legitimization. Oh yes, you said that the historical, Portuguese historical context was very, very different. And the fact that there is resistance. All this resistance speaks to the fact that we have to remember that for centuries people were taught about their own identity, how they're supposed to be, how they were victorious, how they were conquerors. And suddenly the ground is shaking, is shifting around them. Whatever they were told they were is being changed. I'm not trying to justify, I'm just saying that if your identity is attached so strongly to something and it's changing, you have two solutions. Either just cry or try and change it by resisting and clinging onto it. So the fight is normal for them to fight against that. But I also believe in the power, the higher power of education. And it's a case of finding people, it won't be me, I did that so long, finding people who will be able to go and talk to those people, the most racist people that you can find, It might not be you, but I also believe that allyship is about that. It's about talking to people of European descent, talking to people of European descent and telling them how it is. This is where allyship comes in. It doesn't have to be you. And in fact, it shouldn't be you because there's violence in these encounters that we don't need to. And I also want to talk to everybody about this idea of violence, which is really, you have to protect your well-being. We are in a very violent society, going through violent stuff. Protecting your well-being is essential for the fight, for the long durée, for to last in the fight. It also sometimes means stepping back from the fight, pausing, and allowing other generations to actually go from different communities to do that. I can't speak for Portugal and tell them to do things, but each country go at its own space, its own pace. Not voluntarily, they need to be pushed, right? So yeah, push. I think there's something else. No, that was it.
Well, thank you so much. We're going to move into the next session now. João Morato, where are you?
Aqui. O Luca não pode estar, tenho que falar em italiano. O Luca, em conjunto com a Leia, ambos nossos colegas, estão muito cansados e felizes em casa a tratar do seu próprio prémio de extensão humana, que é humilde, recém-nascido e que aparentemente tem umas noites que não são assim tão pacíficas. Ora, nesse registro, o meu papel hoje não é tão interessante quanto o meu, mas é igualmente importante e acho que vão perceber o porquê. É apresentar-vos a edição 2024 do Prémio de Extensão Universitária do Instituto de Ciências Sociais. A extensão universitária, a missão que tem no ICS é, acima de tudo, promover a transferência de conhecimento entre este Instituto de Investigação e a sociedade em geral e, assim, aumentar o impacto das ciências sociais. Dito isto, o problema é fundamental, o da transferência. O prémio funciona de uma maneira muito simples. Há um júri que é constituído por um presidente da comissão, membro do ICS, e 4 membros externos, personagens de reconhecido mérito em várias áreas, desde a ciência política, desde o ativismo em múltiplas causas, inclusive na causa que vimos aqui hoje representada, também outras organizações da sociedade civil, os mídia, etc. É uma panóplia bastante alargada de peritos de reconhecido mérito. Em 2024 foi o espetáculo do poder, política e exposições, entre 1934 e 1940, que foi premiado e é com muito prazer que eu agora chamo aqui ao palco Ana Rita Gori, para quem peço os vossos aplausos.
São 2 palavras, somos todos cansados, mas acho que são importantes. Muito obrigada. É com muita alegria que recebo este prémio. Esta exposição é o resultado de mais de 10 anos de investigação, durante os quais tive a oportunidade de conhecer muitas pessoas e o privilégio de trabalhar e aprender com elas. Por isso, eu sinto que esta foi realmente uma exposição coletiva, que teve a ver com realmente muitos colegas que tornaram-se também amigos. Esta exposição teve como propósito desmontar alguns dos mitos que, como já foi dito, envolvem a memória do Estado Novo e que ainda hoje alimentam uma nostalgia que não é justificável. Este prémio mostra, portanto, que este esforço crítico foi reconhecido e valorizado, e este para mim é especialmente significativo. Quero agradecer ao ICS, não apenas para esta distinção, mas também pelo apoio constante dos colegas e dos doutorandos, que em tantas conversas em frente do café me ajudaram com sugestões preciosas para a exposição e para o catálogo que está a sair agora. Agradeço igualmente ao Patrão dos Descobrimentos e a GEAC, mas sobretudo a Margarida Cor de Carvalho e a Sofia Diniz, que acolheram com entusiasmo a proposta de reunir mais de 200 peças numa sua exposição. Para quem já organizou uma exposição sabe que isto é quase impossível. O meu agradecimento vai também para o Museu M9 e para, de Veneza e a Michelangelo Di Giacomo para a colaboração generosa e finalmente à Fundação Ciência e Tecnologia, a Fundação Luso-Americana de Desenvolvimento e a Fulbright Foundation, que me deram a oportunidade de passar períodos nos estrangeiros e de aprofundar esta investigação. Muito obrigada a todos e a todas e pronto, aqui vai a minha frente.
Agora ter o prazer de mais uma vez introduzir o magnífico reitor da Universidade de Lisboa, Sr. Luís Ferreira, a quem agradeço muito em nome de todos, de todo o ICS, a presença aqui, o apoio inestimável que nos tem dado desde que é reitor desta grande universidade. E é o momento, no fundo, final deste dia, desta palestra de Sedas Nunes, e vou já passar a palavra porque é a senhora reitor que vai concluir esta palestra.
Trouxe aqui umas coisinhas escritas para ser até mais rápido. Começa a naturalmente cumprimentar o Sr. Diretor do ICS, os Srs. Presidentes dos órgãos de gestão, do Conselho de Escola, do Conselho Científico, do Conselho Pedagógico, senhoras e senhores, caros e caras colegas, estudantes, creio que ainda estarão aqui alguns, outros entretanto foram saindo, ilustríssimos convidados. Se calhar pedir desculpa por três coisas. Se calhar fica bem começar por quê? Em primeiro lugar, porque só pude chegar a esta hora, porque outras coisas me agarraram e eu não consegui fazer, apesar de querer ter assistido pelo menos à conferência da professora Otele. Em segundo lugar, porque estavam aqui tão entusiasmados neste colóquio com a professora e se calhar tiveram que fechar isto um bocadinho mais cedo, porque enfim, já estava a chegar ao fim. E por fim, pedir desculpa porque apesar de tudo vou dizer pelas outras coisas que acho que tenho mesmo que dizer, e estou a prolongar o vosso tempo para além daquilo que é o cansaço que já têm de um dia de trabalho aqui nesta matéria. Mas quero dizer-vos que é sempre uma grande honra estar aqui junto de vós, nestes momentos profundamente simbólicos, porque hoje estamos a falar de Sedas Nunes, estamos a falar de alguma coisa que é da sociologia, mas estamos a falar também do reinício de um novo ano, a abertura de um ano. E isso são dois momentos importantes, conjugados num único, e que me dá imensa satisfação. Hoje recordamos e celebramos a figura extraordinária que dá nome a esta palestra anual. Sedas Nunes foi mais do que um grande sociólogo. Foi um espírito pioneiro, um cientista social, que compreendeu antes de muitos que a realidade do mundo exige olhares cruzados, métodos combinados, rigor plural. O ICS nasceu dessa visão, nasceu dessa coragem intelectual e nasceu, como vimos, da matriz interdisciplinar que o GIS, portanto, o Gabinete de Investigações Sociais, inaugurou em 1962, no então ISCEF, hoje ISEF. Desse pequeno núcleo fundador emergiram a análise social, os primeiros estudos modernos sobre desigualdades, sobre a universidade e o desenvolvimento do país. Estudos que, como foi lembrado, estiveram entre os catalisadores das profundas transformações que antecederam a Revolução de 1974. E às vezes esquecemos disso. Parece que foi uma coisa daquele momento. Mas não, há um trabalho de fundo e há pessoas que tiveram esse papel. Uma palestra, portanto, que honra o passado e projeta o futuro. Quero também saudar a professora Otele, portanto, saiu, reconhecendo naturalmente o seu trabalho sobre as representações e trajetórias de afro-europeus, um tema que dialoga diretamente com essa tradição crítica e interdisciplinar que Sedas Nunes inaugurou. Ao revisitar a longa história das relações entre África e Europa e ao mostrar como os discursos aparentemente inclusivos podem reproduzir desigualdades, a professora Otele mostra-nos como as ciências sociais continuam a ser absolutamente indispensáveis para ler o mundo e para o transformar. Não conheço as obras dela, andei a ver na Wikipédia e em tudo o que encontrei sobre ela e portanto, tudo nos dá essa indicação. O ICS é uma das 19 escolas da Universidade de Lisboa e uma das que melhor expressa aquilo que queremos que esta universidade seja: plural, interdisciplinar, internacional, exigente e profundamente ligado aos desafios contemporâneos. Tal como sublinhei em uma ocasião muito recente, na abertura do ano académico do ISEG, há uma semana e pouco, a Universidade de Lisboa tem procurado olhar para o mundo com responsabilidade, com inovação e capacidade de diálogo com a sociedade. Desde os nossos programas pioneiros, como o doutoramento em Planetary Health, ou ainda o doutoramento em sustentabilidade, às iniciativas de inclusão académica, como o programa que lançámos recentemente dos percursos singulares. Se somos uma grande universidade e podemos falar de 54 mil alunos, também somos capazes de falar do António, do Manuel, do Joaquim, que têm dificuldades cognitivas, sofrem de autismo, e nós temos programas para cada um deles desenvolvido individualmente. E no fim temos o emprego deles. Passando pelo reforço da investigação e pela autonomia universitária, que continuaremos a defender com firmeza. Temos amanhã uma reunião com o grupo parlamentar para conseguirmos continuar a trabalhar nas regiões. A história recente da universidade mostra que temos sabido crescer, inovar e proteger o que é essencial: o rigor, a liberdade, a ciência e a educação, como bem público e o serviço ao país. E o ICS tem sido parte central deste percurso e continuará a ser um dos seus pilares. Eu queria agora dizer 2 ou 3 coisas aos estudantes que aqui estão. Abrimos hoje formalmente o nosso ano académico. Abrimos também para muitos um novo capítulo de vida intelectual, profissional e pessoal. No ICS encontrarão seguramente um lugar onde se questiona, onde se debate, onde se pratica o rigor e onde se cultiva a liberdade. Um lugar que valoriza o método, mas também a imaginação sociológica. Um lugar que exige, mas que apoia. Um lugar que observa o mundo sem medo e sem preconceitos. Porque a universidade não é apenas um edifício, nem apenas um sítio onde se aprende. A universidade é uma missão. Uma missão de conhecimento, de justiça social, de humanidade e de futuro. Quero agradecer à direção do ICS e aos seus diversos órgãos, aos investigadores, aos estudantes e trabalhadores técnicos e administrativos. Agradeço igualmente aos intervenientes desta tarde, à premiada e quem fez todo este trabalho para que houvesse este prémio de extensão em Ciências Sociais do ICS. E a todos os que tornam possível esta sessão tão significativa. Queria terminar como comecei, com a recordação de Sedas Nunes. Ele mostrou-nos que as ciências sociais ganham força quando se abrem ao mundo, quando recusam dogmas, quando dialogam entre si e com outras áreas do conhecimento. Que o ICS continue a honrar esse legado e que este novo ano seja um ano de descoberta, de liberdade intelectual e de continuação de grande impacto social como estão a ter. Muito obrigado. Votos de um excelente ano para todos.
Assim sendo, muito obrigada pelas suas palavras. Estou por encerrar esta sessão e creio que temos no 5º andar um ponto de honra e estão todos convidados para este momento. Obrigada.